Hi, I'm Robert. I come from, you pronounce it absolutely correctly, and it's a long name, the Center for Scalable Data Analytics and Artificial Intelligence, KCI, which is a national German artificial intelligence competence center. So the German government realized at some point that we are not as good in AI as other countries, so they are trying to push it. And this gives opportunities to scientists to, for example, get permanent positions. So if if you have heard about the academic hamster wheel, if you wonder why I moved from Dresden to Leipzig after living in Dresden for something like 17 years, it was the academic hamster wheel and the permanent position you can get in these kind of opportunities. So this is academic life. Speaking about academic life or life of a bioimage analyst, yeah. Hmm. So bioimage analysis is about the space in between biology. So I'm not a biologist and computer science. I studied computer science, but when I talk to computer science scientists nowadays, I don't feel like I have actually done pretty much the same thing over the years. So I'm a bioimage analyst. I live in between these two communities, and I'm able to understand both of them partially. So I can translate also between them. And if you think about what the job of a bioimage analyst looks like, this is a pretty realistic mock picture. Deborah Schmidt, you may have heard about her too. This is taken something like a year before we both became group leaders in Berlin and Dresden back in the days. And yeah, we are sitting in front of a computer and we discuss with other scientists image data, and then we write some code, execute it, and then discuss about the results again. So this used to be the life of a bioimage analyst, of a bioimage data scientist for quite some years. And then this happened. Yeah. So it turns out that my job of somebody sends me an image of some cells and they want to, for example, segment nuclei and they want to get some measurements out of it can be done by ChatGPT, at least to some degree. So this slide is already something like 2.5 years old. And you see here, I was prompting, please segment the nuclei in the blue channel of this image, and then ChatGPT was just doing it. Yeah. If you would click there on this small button over here, you would then also get the code which was executed in order to get this segmentation. And that's the state of the art from something like 2 years ago. So one step back, what kind of technology are we talking about? We are talking about large language models. So large language models generate text from text. So I give a prompt, for example, how do fluorescence microscopes work? And then the large language model can generate a text explaining me how these microscopes work. So this was ChatGPT by the end of 2022. So this kind of technology then appeared. And then just something like half a year later, there was a new thing which was not so much discussed in the community, but I guess nowadays it's a different story. Vision language models, which basically combine information from images and text to produce text. And in the very first place, they were, in particular at the very beginning, they were used to describe images. So what is shown in this image? And then the language model, the vision language model could, for example, answer, in this image, I see cell nuclei, presumably imaged with a fluorescence microscope. And what I also figured out quite early, or what I was testing, and I was not expecting that this will just work, you can also use this technology to count objects. So how many objects are in this image? And then this vision language model can, for example, answer with a number. Also here, I tried it very early when this technology came out at the beginning of summer 2023. And at the beginning, I was like many other people on social media making jokes about it. Because here in this case, I post this image and then ChatGPT sees 3 nuclei in this image. And I was like, oh, language models. They will never be capable of doing my job. But actually, I was not doing my job properly because this is like not good scientific practice to only try once and complain about it. So later, I was then doing this experiment, and you can click on this link down there. You can reproduce this experiment if you want to. So I prompted, analyze the following image by counting the bright blobs, respond with the number only, and I did it 25 times. And then you get from different language models which were available in the first half of 2024, you get different distributions of answers. And if we would have a lot of time here, we would do some counting, everybody would count, everybody would have a slightly different number, I presume. So this image I'm using in trainings for many years, and there is no common sense of how many objects are in there. And this has also something to do with the fact that I haven't precisely phrased my question. So for example, do we want to count the objects which are very small or only the big ones? Do we want to count the objects which are on the image border or not? And these kind of things I have not specified, and that's why it makes a lot of sense that there is some variation. So see, these are the models from 2023 actually and 2024. And just to compare how traditionally we would have done that, or I mean, this algorithm Otsuru thresholding, yeah, from 1979, we are still using it in practice because it's actually quite useful for plenty of images. So if you take this image and you process this with this algorithm, you get a count of 62 objects. If you remove the objects on the image border, you get 44. So we can take these two numbers as some baseline information to reproduce our experiment from just a minute ago, and then maybe also with more modern models. So I redid this experiment also for a talk like here today in June 2025. And here you see basically the comparison of these different models, and it's also varying a little bit over time. So maybe something is happening at OpenAI. Maybe they are modifying these models. Maybe I have not prompted often enough. Maybe I should have prompted something like 250 times, and then these distributions would look more similar. What is a little bit more interesting, I would say, here in this case is is that the first model is not available anymore. So we cannot reproduce the very first experiment I did in November 2023 because this company in the US at some point decided to take this model offline. And this is one major reason I'm also giving to decision makers nowadays. We have to have the infrastructure under our control. So, for example, I'm wondering, and maybe somebody can tell me if the Danish government or a Danish research organization at some point will or have put a language model server somewhere academics in the country can use. Or if you are all still using OpenAI and sending your state-of-the-art research questions to a server in a different country. Right? So other countries are ahead, right? So in Germany, we have some servers where we can use these things. Other countries are even forbidding scientists to use OpenAI because of protecting science in a country. So something has to happen here in order to avoid these kind of problems. Just back to the technical side, here you see again, I'm again doing pretty much the same experiment just to demonstrate that prompt engineering, so modifying my prompt to get a different result, still works. So here in this case, I just asked, analyze the following image by counting the bright blobs, respond to only the number. So this is what I did before, and we see also again a distribution like in the other experiments. And then I'm saying, ignore the objects touching the image border, and then you see how this distribution is actually going down and more close to the baseline, where I also was measuring the number of objects without them at the image border. Or I can specify that it should include those at the image border, and then you see also here how the distribution is slightly going up. So technically, prompt engineering works, but I would still maybe say that this is nothing for production use yet. We will come back to this in a minute. So this is all. I was here until this point. I was only using GPT models from OpenAI because also for quite some time there was nothing else available, right? Other companies took a year or two until they put stuff up, and also open weight models, the models you can download, it took some time. It took some years until we had them available. And I was observing that all the time in the first models I saw, which are here in this case Gamma 3.4b and Gamma 3.12b. It's like, I would say, small language models, small vision language models, which actually run on my laptop. And they are from Google. Gamma is from Google. And so now I can do these kind of experiments on my laptop, which has an NVIDIA graphics card. Yeah. So now we have this technology available that we do not have to rely on the providers from other countries, from big companies anymore. And we can go even one step further and see what small language models are capable of doing. So the next task I would like to solve, or I would like to introduce to you, is a bounding box segmentation. I must admit that in practice, when I in particular worked as a group leader image analysis, I think, never used this algorithm because I always want to have a precise outline of the objects and then measure area, whatever. But there are use cases where you just need roughly where the objects are. Just the bounding box might be fine in order to, for example, count them. So one task could be, I would like to ask a vision language model, can you please give me a JSON object of bounding boxes? So that means we have to run some additional Python code here in between to go from this text. A JSON object is a text representation of bounding boxes, of coordinates, and convert this with some Python code into an image which we can look at. And if you try these things out, for example, with GPT 4.0 back in the days, if you stare at that image for some time, you get the feeling that the GPT model understood it, so it does the right thing, but it's a little bit off and everything a little bit shifted. If you look what Claude is doing, and if you again stare at this image for some time, I think it's tilted by 90 degrees and scaled. So somehow they are capable of understanding what I want from them, but they are not capable of doing it. And then I found this model, Moondream 2B. It's 2 orders of magnitude smaller than OpenAI and Claude and can just do this task. Why so? Because it was trained specifically for this, right? And this is what we will see, I presume, in the future more. Small language models which run on laptops, which can solve specific tasks better than the big language models we get from the vendors on the internet. I was driving this a little bit more into the extreme because I really wanted to dive deeper and know how capable this model is. And I was then simulating some data. And here you see how the simulated objects spread in space, as long as there are not so many, the bounding box segmentation actually works quite okay. And at some point, when it becomes too many, it goes crazy. So then it does things like this, right? And then you can also plot this then over time. Also here, this is a Jupyter notebook. You can run yourself, you can reproduce, and then you may also conclude, and it's also in the paper of Moondream, that they were basically training this model on images of objects, not like cell biology or anything, but objects of around 25. So obviously the training data did not contain images with many objects, and that's why this vision language model cannot count many objects. It has never heard about an answer which is 50, for example. Yeah? So it has never seen that. And this is also what we know of in deep learning in general, that extrapolation is typically an issue. In order to train a model which is capable of solving your question, you have to somehow capture in the training data what also will later happen in the reality where you want to apply this model. And this is pretty much how far I was driving it. I tried a lot of other things with vision language models. For example, I was putting images in there with 2 channels, and then I wanted to know how many objects are double positive or have bright intensities of objects in both channels. These models are not capable of doing this at all. I have the feeling they don't even understand what I'm talking about. So maybe there was no training data of this kind in here. But what I was using quite more in detail, because I think this is, at least for now, the best thing we can do with language models is we can use them for translating human language into code. And there is a huge business model behind many companies working on this, trying to improve models. And that's why I think this will also be very useful also for our community, for the bioimaging team. There's some statistics. I was quite impressed by this paper. Also, if you care about how they did it, the method is described super nicely, and I fully trust it. That's a really nice experiment where they plot over time how many contributions which were uploaded to github.com appear substantial fractions of AI-generated code. And they trained a model which I really trust can differentiate these things. And here you see that since the end of 2022, when ChatGPT was published, and then later on more models came, also a little bit dependent on the country where the people are working in, more and more AI-generated code is uploaded to github.com. These are not AI agents yet working autonomously and programming stuff. This is more likely, I would say, code that is generated, for example, in ChatGPT. People copy paste it over, modify it, and then upload it to github.com. So the remaining question here is, how good are these models or these generated codes from these models for bioimage analysis? And there we did some more detailed analysis because we really wanted to know to which degree we can trust this technology. So here's a workflow. I go from an image to a binary image to a label image, and then I measure the area of these objects and I compute the average area. And then I ask basically language models, so I programmed this out. This is the reference you will find here in this edition, in this next plot. So I programmed this out, and if I execute my code 10 times, it will always be right. And that's why the chance of the reference that the code produces the correct result is typically 100%. It's a kind of a sanity check. And then I asked, for example, Claude 10 times to program this, and it was in 10 out of 10 cases producing the right result within a certain error bound, for example. So that means the language model has a 100% chance to produce code which solves this kind of problem. And depending on which language model you look at, this chance is a little bit different. And there's also other use cases. So for example, here you see computing the correlation matrix from a table. This is with Python and Pandas. That's a single line of code. And maybe that's why it is the chance that the language models can solve this is higher compared to having to write multiple lines of code and then they all have to work together. On the other hand, you can also find use cases like this one, opening a ZAR file, a B-ZAR file, is challenging. And this might have something to do with the fact that ZAR is still under development. And if you are in this domain, you may know that also the ZAR library is changing massively from one version to another, and you don't know if the language model was trained on this one or on that one. Also, example code is a bit spread over the internet and not as much as, for example, pandas data frames. And that's why the chance that these models can here write code to open the ZAR file is lower. Still, one Claude model in 7 out of 10 cases managed quite well. And you can summarize this kind of statistics over multiple use cases, over multiple language models. You find the best language model here on the left, the worst language model on the right. And obviously, there's a couple of tasks which these models can solve quite reliably. And then here on the bottom, you see a couple of tasks which they cannot do at all. They have no idea how to solve these things. Overall, the good commercial, I must highlight here at that point, the commercial models are the good ones, not the open models you can download. They are worse, but the good commercial models have a chance of something like 50, 60%, 50-50 chance that the code that is generated is doing the correct thing. You will now say, 50-50, okay. But if you ask me to write code, write 10 lines of code for segmenting an object, for measuring the area, average, and so on, my chance that I can write this code in one shot and execute it and it produces the correct result is certainly less than 50%. So, and I can also not do it in 5 seconds. So you can here already say that vision language models for code generation are outperforming human performance quite by a lot, I would say. So this is obviously a core part of the work of an image analyst, writing code for analyzing images and getting a result out. Another important task is, and that's what also people approached me in the past a lot, what kind of algorithm do I need to apply to segment a specific image? So I've done this kind of consulting much more than I was actually writing code for people. And nowadays people come less and less because of ChatGPT. So also here the question is, how good are these models actually in doing these kind of things? Also here an experiment. I was first prompting a language model without providing any image. You are a bioimage analysis expert, right? It's prompt engineering. What is the best processing algorithm to segment microscopy images? Also a bit vague, but nevertheless. Answer the algorithm only, no explanations. And then I passed this to a language model. I think I was using GPT-4o here. And then I was visualizing the resulting algorithm names as this word cloud thingy. So the largest word in this word cloud is the most prominent answer, and the smaller words are just happening once or twice or definitely less. So cell pose, yeah, I kind of agree. Deep learning, you could also say that. I think I could not find deep lab, or deep lab was something from a different domain. It has nothing to do with our kind of image analysis. So obviously it can produce answers which somehow make sense, but it's not so, we don't have to use cell pose for every image, and it may also not work with all images, or maybe it will. So I, as an image analyst, I would more aim for finding an algorithm which is as simple as possible to answer the question and not throw deep learning at everything, right? So this would be good scientific practice. So let's guide the language model a little bit more and provide an image. So what is the best image processing algorithm to segment this microscopy image? And then I basically provided you this image showing membrane staining. And the language model says watershed. And if you look in the textbooks, if you look in the training materials we were publishing over the recent years, this is what we say. If you have an image with membrane staining, you use the watershed algorithm. If you have an image with nuclei, you would maybe use also thresholding, as I have shown before. When they are becoming a little bit denser, you can also use the watershed algorithm there. So this is what we really teach. That all makes sense. And I also wanted to confuse the system a little bit with this colorful image where I don't even specify what I want to segment, and then it also struggles giving good advice. Watershed, also thresholding, maybe cell pose. So independent from the images I provide, it always says watershed and also thresholding to some degree, right? It's not really helpful, but again, prompt engineering. So here, you are a bioimage analysis expert. You have a rule book of what algorithm to apply for specific images. And then I was basically here giving 4 rules just for demonstrating how this principle works. And the first rule is, if an image shows sparse objects such as nuclei, use Otto thresholding, and it pretty much captures that when I give this image. If the image shows dense, partially overlapping objects, such as nuclei, use stardust, and it also captures that. It still guesses Otto thresholding, but when you look at this image, the objects are not all dense, and that's why It's somewhere in between. Maybe stardust, maybe it's thresholding. Kind of agree. If you have image showing cell-like structures with bright membranes, watershed, and bam, watershed. And in case of doubt, use cell post. And so this is what it's doing, right? And again, here, Jupyter Notebook, you can reproduce this analysis if you want to. So it's not like absolute. The output of language models is not guaranteed. It will not always respond with cell post. It sometimes also says something else. But it's at least a way with prompt engineering techniques, without training a fancy model ourselves, how we can guide the vision language model, giving advice to people. And you could write such a rule book for your lab. So together with your colleagues, you write down such a rule book, and then you always, when you ask ChatGPT about code, you provide this rule book. In our lab, we use this Python library, and we use these kind of code snippets for specific use cases we have on a daily basis. We don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. And if you are sharing this among colleagues, you will also realize that you can easier read the code from your colleagues because you're all using the same code snippets in similar situations when you process similar images. And such a thing I also wanted to build for the community, and this is how Bia-bob came up. So Bia-bob is a Python library, works in Jupyter Lab, which is such a rule book. It contains, it depends a little bit on what you have installed on your computer, but it contains something like 200 rules in which scenario to do what, and what libraries to use for visualizing images, segmenting images, and so on. And what it at the end, you do not see this rule book anymore, you just enter what you want to do. So here in this case, for example, it says, load blobs.tif from disk, segment the bright objects in the dark background, measure area and parameter of the object, show the original image, the segmented image, and an area versus parameter plot side by side. Then shift enter, Jupyter, and you get code. As a good scientist, you would read this code carefully, line by line, and make sure that it's really doing what you're expecting, or you just execute it. And then you can see this result. For those of you who have time, the second hour today, we will try this thing out. I will give you access to the language model server at my partner institution in Dresden. So we will not send your scientific questions to an American server. It will go to University in Dresden. We will not use it for language model training or anything. At the moment when your prompt is processed, the data is gone. So we don't save it. But who's interested can join, and we can do this together. So Bob can obviously, with precise instructions, can write code. And these precise instructions can also additionally contain images so that you can then use the vision language model part. So here I'm basically loading an image with normal Python code, and then I'm handing it over to Bob. So here it says percentage Bob, HeLa cells, which is this variable I was introducing here before. And then in very detail, I describe what needs to be done. Please write a Jupyter notebook, an entire notebook, for processing this image. And an important thing we learned along the way was that in the beginning of this notebook, first describe this image before you write code about it. That's also good scientific practice. When I work together with someone on a Jupyter notebook, I often forget it, but also I should at the beginning write for which kind of data this notebook has been written. I have in the past have situations where I wrote some code for analyzing fluorescence microscopy images, and then half a year later, somebody completely different approached me with this code saying, Robert, it doesn't work for my electron microscopy images. Yeah, sure. But if I would have written at the very beginning that it's not meant for this kind of data, but for other data, I would have had less trouble. With the language models, the reason is the vision language model has to basically express what it's seeing. There are nuclei, so that then the further generation of the code is towards nuclei. So it has to somehow express in a text form first what kind of image data we are looking at, what kind of structure we are going to segment, and then it can actually solve this problem. The chance of producing correct code for this would be lower if we don't write this at the very beginning. And then below you would find a link to the notebook. You can click on the notebook. Here you basically see how I'm scrolling down this notebook. And this is very, very close. It's a basic question, yes, but it's very close to the kind of work I, as a bioimage analyst, have done for multiple years together with collaborators. People approach me, how can we process this data? And I was writing a Jupyter notebook with a step-by-step explanation of how to process this data. I also switched fully intentionally from Fiji to Jupyter, because here you can see step by step, this line of code is doing this, and you can see it, you can understand it, you can learn, and next time you can do it yourself. If I send you a 200-line ImageJ macro, which magically just does the job, you may not be able to learn what these individual lines are doing, and that's why the learning is not working so well with this technology. Jupyter is for data science questions really amazing, because you have these intermediate steps where you can see the intermediate results and you can follow the pipeline and you can reproduce it also on a level of understanding, not just on a computational level. Okay, so far we have mostly talked about segmentation, and also in our community, many scientists, many computer scientists writing their PhD focus on segmentation. So if you think about segmentation, you may want to denoise your image before, you may want to do some background removal, but actually, or deconvolution, but actually the fun part starts, from my perspective, after the segmentation, because there's so many things you can do with this partially tabular, partially spatial data, and you can combine them. You can do dimensionality reduction, classification, clustering, supervised, unsupervised machine learning. So there's a lot of things to do, but it's also a lot of things to learn. So my impression from looking back in the last decade where I work in this domain, that crossing this border seems challenging. I'm just trying to put myself in a position of a biologist. I studied biology because I did not want to study computer science. And now I'm sitting there and they are telling me that I have to learn programming, I have to learn segmentation, I have to learn background subtraction, deconvolution, and then I also have to learn feature extraction, dimensionality. No. And then there's a lot of people trying to improve the segmentation algorithm because they understand that. I fully understand them. So this is challenging because you have to have a wide variety of computational skills to achieve all this. And even I studied computer science. I'm working in this domain now for 10, 15 years. And also me, it took me ages to understand all that to a degree where I can give proper advice. But ChatGPT, can you help me writing code for denoising an image? Absolutely. Here it goes. Can you help me segmenting an image? Yeah, klar, absolutely. Here you go. Can you help me extracting features? Yes. Can you generate a U-map from the table of measurements? Absolutely. It always starts with absolutely. Right? So it's absolutely clear that it can do this. So obviously, this technology can answer a variety of questions far beyond image segmentation. And also just here, one more example. Can you help me writing code for clustering object based on a table of mesh? Absolutely. What I want to point out here on this slide is, if you ask, for example, Gemini is not saying absolutely. Gemini is asking a question, and this is also what I, as an image analyst, would actually do. What kind of data are you working with? And Claude is working similarly. So those of you who have so far only played with ChatGPT and are maybe using it on a regular basis, I would recommend you to try out these other models which are out there. According to our benchmark, Claude is better than GPT, like measurably, like 5% higher chance of having functional correct code. It might not matter if you have a chance of 60% or 65%. But these chat apps ask questions. What kind of data do you want to process? What is the result you want to get from that? And I would actually say this is good scientific practice. Just producing code which may or may not do the job is maybe not a good idea. So consider trying out other tools. And as I'm talking about other tools, the number of code generation AI systems is completely exploding. I first saw the project Ada, which is a command line tool, where you say, I want to have an app, and this app should be executed in the browser, and it should be a game where I have like this and that, and you explain what you want. And then Ada is generating some code, executing it, looking at the result. There's an error, fixing the error, and doing this in a loop. So this is an AI agent doing a task for you. It's basically acting on your behalf. There's also Jupyter AI, which is also in Jupyter Notebooks, an additional chat window where you also can generate notebooks. There's Napari ChatGPT, where you in Napari can ask to rotate the image, to segment the image, to do these kind of things. The BioImage IO chatbot. Then we have ChatGPT Codex, also something worth trying. Claude Code, also an agent, and so on and so on. Cursor and All Hands AI. So these are all, or most of them, are AI agents which take the task and solve it for you. And you are there pretty much alone interacting with this system. So I was also thinking of how to improve the situation a little bit. In particular, when people interact with such a system who cannot code, it might be an issue because they may not be able to differentiate the functional code from the not so functional code. But it's also hard to basically take a long conversation with a chat and then go to an expert. Can you please tell me if this works or not? How can I know? So the idea here was to basically bring the humans together with language models in one chat. That was work of mine something like a year ago, 1.5 years ago. So the idea is the following. A domain expert, it could, for example, be a biologist, could say, hi, I have data and I would like to measure X. And then there's a data analyst saying, for these kind of things, we may want to try this algorithm. And then it basically asks Git-bob, can you please show us how to do this with Python? And then Git-bob is an artificial intelligence, an AI system, which uses a language model in behind to produce code, and it shows the code to these two people. And then the data analysis expert may, for example, say, yeah, that's nice, but for visualization, let's better use a violin plot and not a box plot, because box plots are sometimes hiding stuff. And then also the data analyst can ask Git-bob, can you please use this other language model for these kind of tasks? And then here it could then respond back and also execute this code. At the end, and this is again what I would say is good scientific practice, the data analyst should look at it and say, yeah, the code looks reasonable and the results look okay, but also the domain expert should look at the data and say, yeah, okay, this is kind of in the range of what we were expecting, or it confirms our hypothesis or not, and we have to basically continue our experiments. So bringing multiple language models and multiple humans together in one chat is something new, and I was capable of publishing this back to the academic hamster wheel. But now this can be bought. Yeah? There's multiple companies, including GitHub themselves, who offer this as a service. So you don't have to use my open source solution. It might be interesting to see how internally it works, but there is products of this. There's a huge business model behind. Just a quick look how this looks in practice. And again, it does not matter if you use Git-bob or if you use one of these commercial solutions. You basically open on github.com in the browser, you upload your image, and you say, I would like to, for example, classify this image and write code for that. And here in this case, you say, Git-bob, can you please try to do this? And then Git-bob comes with an answer, explains a little bit what it was doing. There's a text file with likelihoods of what in this image might be. So for example, there's a sewing machine in there and a toaster and an iron. Does not see the cat for whatever reason. And it gives you a Jupyter notebook. And this Jupyter notebook was obviously executed. But this is basically what is different compared to Bia-bob before. This system is taking your question, generating code, executing the code. If there is an error in this code, it fixes this code, and it continues like that, not forever, but for some iterations, and then gives you the result, and you can download this Jupyter notebook and run it on your computer. So it basically frees you to some degree from doing these tiny steps all the time. And if you, for example, work with Bia-bob, you generate code and it breaks and you have to fix it, and it becomes a bit annoying, and that's why these things are developed right now. Again, I'm not the only one. I have 10 minutes left, so let's talk about what comes next. I guess, and also again, companies are working on this, some of these things you can already find also out of the open source space. I guess the way how we were working in the past is not obsolete, but limited. If a domain expert sends me data, so I'm now the data analyst over there, and I typically work like this. I try an algorithm and it may not work. And then I try another algorithm, which basically may also force me to also run another algorithm. And then at some point I have a result. I'm busy like crazy. So that's the point where I stop and give something back, and then talk to the domain expert, and we basically look at this data together. Some people may have more time. They may try out one more algorithm. But at the end, it boils down to there is much more options we could try, but we don't have the time to do this. That's why we are always limited to some degree. But if there is a crowd of AI agents doing this, you have much more options. And this is basically what I think, what we are seeing it somehow already a little bit in the software engineering domain, in the image analysis domain. I have not seen it yet, except what I will show you on a couple of slides, is that we can now ask multiple AI agents to analyze this data in parallel, and then we can have a look at those results, and we can also cherry pick. So we can pick a result that is best. Of course, here the data analyst and the domain expert should again interact closely with each other and maybe tune these prompts and really look carefully in these different results and make a good decision. So I was at the beginning saying that ChatGPT is basically eliminating the need that we talk to each other, because we can just talk to ChatGPT. But in this scheme here, you see that this scheme actually brings data analysts and domain experts back together. So we can sit together in front of a screen and ask an AI, can you please analyze this data set? And then we can look in the results more or less immediately. So we don't have to spend like 2 weeks. One person is programming something and then comes back to the other person. The process might actually be faster. So this is an opportunity from my perspective. How does it look in practice? So this is not open source yet, but I was showing it before. That's why I'm also happy showing it here. We are not asking Bob anymore. This is Alice. Awesome complaints back in the days that it's only male names, and I really was sorry for this, but Bob is a short form for Robert. So I'm trying to make myself obsolete. Nevertheless, Bob has now a friend, it's Alice, and Alice is much more advanced. Alice can do much better things than Bob could. So here in this case, I have to specify, this is an AI agent, and I have to specify my task very precisely. In particular, I should not focus so much anymore of what I want to do step by step. I'm somehow phrasing it here, but much more important is to phrase what I'm expecting as a result. I must be very clear on this part. So here in this case, we have in a subfolder input data, a time-lapse TIFF, and there are multiple channels in this image. And in this image, we want to segment the nucleus, and we want to measure the intensity in the nuclear envelope. This is a data set from the EMBL Heidelberg, and this data set was part of training materials for quite some time. Kota Miura wrote a book chapter about it. So this is kind of a well-known educational data set. And I'm basically telling Alice in very detail what I want to do with this data set, and I want to have a plot of intensities in the nuclear envelope over time. And then Alice is under the hood starting 10 AI agents, which will produce code, execute the code. If there is a bug in this code, it will fix this code. It will also look at the result and compare the result with my expectation of the result. Is there a plot of the intensity over time? No, then we have to change the code again. And it's doing this doing this 10 times in parallel. And at some point it will stop and it will not show us this one result ChatGPT is showing us. ChatGPT shows us only one. It shows us 10 results. And you can then explore these 10 results, and you can even go through these intermediate results and look at them. And you may note here that these plots which come out look different. How often have you asked ChatGPT for some code for doing data analysis? Have you ever asked the same question 10 times, executed this code 10 times, and look at the differences, right? So nobody has time for doing this. Here we have an opportunity to do it semi-automatically. So here in this slide, you see these 10 plots which come out of the system. There's still one case where it doesn't work at all. And if you now look at these plots and you compare them a bit, and you also stare at this video for quite some time, what is kind of common is the intensity in the nuclear envelope is increasing, in particular in the first half of the video. And then afterwards, I'm not exactly sure what's happening. Is it decreasing again, or is just a little defocus in the image? So I'm not 100% sure. And the language model is also not 100% sure. But you do see some patterns. So it is increasing at the beginning. There are 2 peaks, and afterwards it's decreasing a little bit or staying stable, something in this direction. So this is self-consistency. And it's also reported in the language model domain that self-consistency is something. If you have, if you ask a language model 10 times and you get 10 complete answers, at least 9 of them have to be wrong. So that's kind of a proof. But if you get 7 times the same answer, doesn't mean that it's right. Right? So you have to be a little bit careful over here. So if you compare our plot to the plot Kota Miura in this book chapter had, you see a similar pattern, but also a different pattern. And that's why we will see in the future more and more AI agents who can do exactly that. They produce 10 codes for you, and you can explore them, you can look at the results, and you should keep in mind that self-consistency is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for functional correctness. So you have to be really careful, and for example, also hang out again with a domain expert and a data analysis expert to look at the code exactly and look at the intermediate results and choose carefully which of these 10 codes is maybe the one is producing the most correct or the most reasonable results. Good. Let me just summarize. Using AI and large language models for bioimage data analysis code generation seems increasingly unavoidable. Around me, I work in an AI institute. I think there's nobody who writes code by themselves anymore to a large degree. Maintaining good scientific practice is super challenging, in particular in this peer review phase, because you can just generate plenty of code, but reading all this, it's so much time. Do we really have to? To some degree, not. But at the end, before a workflow, before a code becomes part of a scientific project, we should, because we humans are responsible for this. So we should compare different language models. We should compare different service providers. I would always recommend trying out local language models or maybe on institutional infrastructure if they are enough for solving the problem, if you can avoid ChatGPT and the commercial solutions out in the cloud. Yeah, and applying good scientific practice, questioning the methods. Tell ChatGPT, I'm not sure if also thresholding is still state of the art. What else can we do? So these kind of things I would highly recommend. So, and I'm also saying, but this is a hypothesis, and we can talk about it again in a year or two, that we are on the edge towards AI agents analyzing image data autonomously. I would like to thank my collaborators and my team in Leipzig who are keeping my back free while I'm traveling and visiting you guys. And I thank you for your attention.